I have to start with a warning. This is going to be very much an unconventional kind of thing. I think some of you might realize halfway into today that maybe this is not quite your thing. Why is that? I plan on teaching this in all the ways in which I was never taught a class in school or in general. And it might just not fit everyone. So if you're the kind of person that likes neatly arranged concepts that are easy to digest, this is not going to be it. So I'm basically taking all the best advice on how to do a presentation, like TED Talk, and I'm going to throw that out of the window, apologizing in advance that this kind of format might be frustrating for some of you. So before going into the actual topic, a bit of introduction, I guess. I think some of you know me. A few of you know me very, very well, and I'm so happy that you're here. By the way, there's some people in the audience that are like a very big deal in the VR world, and CEO of some companies that are doing amazing things. So I'm hoping they will start to jump in with questions and additions and correcting me on a bunch of stuff sooner rather than later. So be prepared for that kind of workshop as well. Very briefly about myself. I don't like to start with a big introduction about who I am. I much rather have you guys feel the freedom afterwards to ask me questions also about more private questions about the company and everything. So I'll just give a 2-sentence summary now and we can get into it more later. So I was trained as an architect, but that's kind of starting in the middle of my career. To say one sentence about what was before, I always had a passion for computers because my dad was trying to figure out how PCs work in the 80s, and he was bringing home keyboards. And I was learning letters and numbers on keyboards. And this was the time even before floppy disks. So I was trading with my dad audio cassettes because we were recording his MS-DOS piece of software that he was writing on audio cassettes, and we didn't have enough. So he had to take some of mine, which had my favorite stories on them. But I kind of grew up, typing letters into a black screen and then pressing enter and then seeing little lines being drawn on the black screen. And that was always like something quite fascinating. Until I got to architecture school, I kind of had this very atypical set of interests. I always loved art. I have been classically trained in classical drawing and painting for about 7 years. So I was in an art school, but I always loved math. So math was like my thing. And it was just basically no avenue for someone that is training to become a classical painter to also study math. But I found some ways, and I started to participate in national math and physics competitions, and win awards and do quite well. But I've basically lived my life as a bit of an outsider because I was being made fun of that. Here's the painter from our school winning awards at national math competitions. So I decided that for a person who has these two different interests, maybe architecture could be the way, because it famously brings together art and the analytic mind of someone that has like an engineering bending. So I went on and did architecture. However, I went through architecture school also feeling quite unfulfilled, although it was supposed to be the merger of all my interests. It kind of was, and it kind of wasn't. And a lot of the things that I experienced as kind of the elephant in the room that no one was talking about in architecture school, and then later on in architecture practice, ended up being the reasons why, when I discovered virtual reality, I started a virtual reality company. So that happened about 6 years ago. And at that time, I had recently quit my job in corporate America I was working for a very large company doing skyscrapers in Asia. And I thought that was my dream. I thought that's kind of the best it can get in terms of my architecture career. I ended up being very unhappy. I took a year break, came to Europe, where I was a project manager and like the head designer for a wonderful, wonderful, cute mid-rise development in Prague. And I thought, what can be more wonderful than to be in Europe and be an architect on this, in this most beautiful jewel of a city, doing like healthy urbanism, like mid-rise. And I was unhappy again quite fast. So I realized, okay, maybe it's not architecture, maybe it's me, although of course it's also always architecture. And at this point, I got an invitation to go to a VR studio in Stuttgart. This was in Stuttgart, Germany, where I tried a DK1. And it completely blew me away to such an extent to which it kind of pushed me to basically quit my job 2 weeks later. And start bring back my long forgotten coding skills and relationship with MS-DOS and computers, but this time no more audio tapes, and learn how to code, learn how to use a game engine, because basically I realized that virtual worlds are two things that I knew how to do quite well as an architect. It's about being able to envision and design 3D environments, and being able to overlap behaviors on top of that. The behavior part had to do with the training that any architect goes through when we take sociology courses and philosophy courses and our history courses, in trying to understand what people do in our buildings or what they're supposed to. And of course, the behavior part also has to do with being able to code those behaviors. So that's how Numena started. And I didn't really want to have my own company. That is one of the most intense and difficult things I've ever had to do. I don't necessarily recommend it to anyone. It just happened that there was no other company that I knew of or that I could find at that time. This is around 2015, 16, that was bringing together architecture and coding to create applications that pursue a certain kind of concepts. I had zero interest, and I still do not, in using VR just to visualize architecture. There are many companies that do this wonderfully. There are many pieces of software from Autodesk and many others that allow you to take the building that you design in whatever architecture software, put it in VR, walk through it, and add animations and stuff. Just simply this visualization process has never been an interest. And by the end of the 4 days, I think you'll have a better understanding of exactly what is it that I wanted to do and still do. So the objective of the class is to help people, to explain to people, I guess, a belief that I have, which is this technology has a depth and a potential that we're not fully seeing yet. And in order to be able to really start to tackle these things, we have to start with the basics. And by basics, I mean something no other teacher teaching something like this will ever start with. By basics, I mean, let's talk about what reality is. Let's talk about what the actual world is. Let's talk about how physics and gravity works, how our bodies operate within it, how physical bodies think and move through physical reality. Because what I found for myself is that I wasn't really having a good enough grasp on the theoretical basis and implications of that to then really understand where we could take virtual reality. And like many people in virtual reality right now, I also have a background of growing up with things like lucid dreams. And this is, I'm not going to cover this at all. This is not about anything spiritual or esoteric. By the way, I'm not religious, I'm not spiritual. But by now, I believe that it is no coincidence that when you get into it and you meet people active in this area and you ask them, have you had lucid dreams when you were a kid? Do you still have them? They'll probably say yes. So that's kind of where this hunch started, that this is an environment that can do things that are just wildly different than what physical reality can do. And I deeply believe that we're not there yet. I believe that we're not even close to even having a conversation about what virtual reality can actually do. Clearly, if we're talking about training, and we've seen amazing VR applications doing tech training in healthcare, and it's going into education in many, many, many areas. Clearly, that is kind of the business study and it's driving the development of the industry right now. And it's wonderful and it's working, right? They're like showing efficiencies and amazing positive reasons why you should do it, and you should complement actual training with virtual reality training. But that's not what I'm talking about at all. And when it comes to this extra, like what can VR be that physical reality is not, and why? I think we don't even know how to talk about that. So this workshop is my first very, very small attempt to throw a few things out there in front of a group of people, and with your help to see how we even start having this conversation. I assume we might go through some series of disagreements and fights, and that would be amazing because I can't think of a better start to this conversation. And so when I watch all of these marketing videos, all of the beautiful demos various developers are doing and put on Twitter, that we all love and applaud. But when I watch all of this, nothing clicks for me. Nothing has really clicked for me yet. I'm still like, it's close, but really this is not it. So what are the expected results? At a minimum, I would like everyone to have a hopefully wider understanding of what the problem area is in virtual reality. Like how wide should we spread our wings when it comes to looking at sources of inspiration for conceptualizing what virtual reality might be about beyond a reproduction of physical reality? And I'm going to go mostly into philosophy and cognitive neuroscience in trying to give actual examples of, well, how far will this far? And there's potential even in this direction. But there are many, many, many other areas. Really quickly, a little bit of the outline, but as I said, this is not intended to be anything neatly thought out. The main thing I want to jump to is part one, which brazenly asks the question, what is the world? The second part equally brazenly asks the question, how do human beings function in the world? And again, I will not be presenting any neat answers to this because they do not exist. We could spend weeks and months having panels with the most amazing scientists in the world, and they will not find an agreement on these things. I just think that we got to the point where unless we start to tackle this with the messiness of what these questions imply as a community, we will keep failing to find answers. And then the second part, the last 2 days, will tone down a bit on the speculative talk and the craziness, and we'll start to kind of come down to earth a bit and say, okay, after this wild speculation, after we've looked at some papers, after we've gave our unscientific opinion about this and that neuroscientific paper, what does this mean for us? Like, what does this mean for virtual space? What are some field observations that we can make from having spent a lot of time in virtual reality? Because I think we should tackle the problem of how do we frame our own framework for VR from these two different perspectives. So one perspective is the more scientific research philosophy, and the other one is so let's call this top down, and then there's the bottom up perspective. So the bottom up is what I call the field observation. So we don't want to read some paper and then just purely based on that come up with some structure of what VR should be. We should very much bring in the bottom up field observations that most of us have from having spent hours playing games or hours with our friends in VR chat and so on. And the last part is about what we've already done and what's on the drawing board at Numena right now. So again, going after we start very, very, very high in a cloud of speculation, we're gonna go down, down, down until we hit the ground with, okay, what has Numena done so far? What have other companies have done so far that's valuable and worth including into the conversation? Where are we now? What is the state of the industry now? And a few practicalities for those of you that might want to get some practical information from this course, as in, hey, what kind of assets can I produce if I know this and this piece of software, or if I come from architecture or some other kind of background, where is my place even in this industry? Like, what are the boundaries of this? So that's what we will end with. In terms of the actual, how we're going to get through the first initial discussions, which I keep warning you will be difficult. I like this idea of recontextualizing things a lot. So I propose this in day one, which is today. We look at a bunch of concepts together. We look at a bunch of examples, and hopefully we try to get some discussion going. And on day two, we actually, I will take notes during the discussion we have today, and I will start tomorrow on day two with putting the discussion that we just had in a structure and trying to give it a frame. So I'm proposing that we get messy today, we all sleep on it, and we start the next day by trying to frame what the discussion was about and clean it up. Then we introduce new concepts in day two, and then day three kind of repeats the thing. So we sleep on it for one night, and then we try to structure and frame the next day in the morning for some of you, late afternoon for some of us in Europe. All right, before I go on, are there any thoughts or questions about these parts? Alex is like, you're wrong about all of this. I know, Alex. Also, are you muted by default, and is there anything I need to do to make sure everyone can unmute themselves at any point?
No, I think we're just muted by default so that people coming in don't interrupt. But I imagine others.
To unmute. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right. What is the best way to ask a question? Raise a hand. Charlie, I would say just ask the question. Maybe raise the hand. We can do the raise the hand if it becomes too much. But at this point, I would say just unmute yourself and ask. Do you have a question right now, or was this more of a general question?
This was just a general, like, how to get through the chaos of the day.
Okay. Charlie, by the way, nice to meet you. Charlie and I have been talking on Twitter for the past maybe 2-3 years. It's wonderful to hear your voice, and it's very nice to meet you.
Thank you. Same here.
All right, so then I will just proceed with the first part. Okay, what is the world? Let's take a shot at it. And I mentioned this before. The point is not to convince anyone of anything. I have very particular schools of thought that I more or less follow to allow me to even get into this discussion, right? Because otherwise, where do you start? Like you have to start within a certain school of thought. And I'm going to be very transparent about which schools of thought are behind me when I make the statements that I'm going to make. But the point is not to convince you that those are the right schools of thought for you or right in any way, because they are not. The point of this discussion is to raise doubt. What do I want to raise doubt about? I want to raise doubt about the following view of the world that I think everyone kind of abides by. It's the view that we are these creatures in a world, and what we perceive and what we think about the world is the actual world. So for me, it is impossible to start any discussion about what virtual reality is if we do not have a working definition of what the physical world is. And right now, I'm proposing that the unspoken default working definition that almost everyone has, which is that what I see and what I hear and what I believe about the world is faulty. It's inaccurate. So let's see what are some schools of thought that are attacking this default definition about the world and how exactly are they doing it. The most basic level that I could find and that I kind of use in my head to start this discussion is what's called the correspondence theory of truth. So if you know a little bit about physics, you know that there's been a lot of progress done since Newton, right? And now they are dealing with some pretty shady stuff. But without going into the shady stuff, the physicists do not agree with amongst themselves. There is a point between that and Newton that we generally agree on, which is that physical reality at some sort of macro level is made out of fields of radiation and lumps of stuff. Again, let's not go to quantum level. Let's just say lumps of electrons and protons and just lumps flowing and floating in these fields of radiation. So there is the correspondence theory of truth says that there is a reality out there, and our perceptual system and our brain, so the organ that is dealing with processing the information that comes from the perceptual system and drawing conclusions about the world based on that, is homomorphic to this lumpiness out there. So of course, colors are not really out there. Of course, chairs and tables are not really out there. But what is there is homomorphic. That is, it is structurally similar to what we perceive. So even if we perceive these fields of radiation in a very human kind of way, because we were born with certain senses, there is still a logical connection between what's out there and what we see and what we think we see. And again, so homomorphism, some of you might not know this word, is defined as a structure preserving mapping between two algebraic structures. So in this case, the one algebraic structure would be reality with capital R that's out there, that will never be fully knowable to us, or I guess that's not a discussion. And it is mapped to the second algebraic structure, which is our perceptual mechanism and our brain. Now, even this, which now is starting to be like more like, okay, that's kind of logical, So most people will not disagree with anything that I just said. They'll say, well, of course, this is the case. But on a daily basis, we don't actually believe this, right? Like on a daily basis, it would be too much cognitive effort for us to say, oh, this table, maybe, is it here? Is it not? Is this like somehow different? And is it just me as a human being that's perceiving this thing here or not? So it on a daily basis, and also at the level of culture, we still very much believe that what we see is really what's out there. And then the next few slides will go into examples that start to give a glimpse at how wide is this gap, right? Because when I talk about these things, I have people asking me, okay, but this wall is really here, right? Like, how can it not be? So where is the gap? Like, okay, where red is not really out there, everyone gets that, but this wall has to be in physical reality, right? Otherwise we're getting into like crazy territory. So let's try to hone in on that. And by the way, I want to also add this, that not everyone agrees at this point with the correspondence theory of truth. There are some very, very interesting, very smart people out there that are running some math, doing some math that's looking pretty good and pretty interesting, that is starting to form a body of work that's a refutation to the correspondence theory of truth. They're basically saying that we might still have survived as a species even without this correspondence. But that's a very interesting discussion for another day. That's really, again, it's not that we live in a simulation story, but it is about how we might completely make up some things. So to put a little bit of a further spin on this, when I read things like this about this homomorphism and this mapping between what we think of the world and what the world actually is, it's clear that the mapping is not tight. And what I've been reading and focusing on in trying to help me understand what does this mean, it's called Inaction Theory. So Inaction Theory is one of the most powerful attempts to fight what in contemporary society and culture is referred to as dualism. So dualism was framed by Descartes. You might have also heard it being referred to as Cartesian anxiety. This started in the 1600s, 1700s, and completely took over the way the Western world thought about reality, which is the famous, I think, therefore I am. The fact that the only thing that I can be sure of is what's inside my mind. The world out there is completely separated from it. So the world out there, I can only know it through internal projections, right? And that turn into subjectivism. And then out of that grew another big cultural movement saying, no, we can recover the world. We can find ways to make it objective. We can find ways to be sure about what's out there without relying on our internal projections. There was never a resolution to this. Even the current debate on things like what is consciousness, do we have free will? Those are the latest incarnation on this issue. The inaction theory that I'm going to use to talk about this mapping that's tight or not tight is one theory that started to say, okay, we have to look at this afresh, because no matter what we do, we are still stuck with these 2 points of view that we cannot possibly bring together. So this is a quote from Varela, who wrote in 1991, a book called Embodied Cognition that started the inactive cognition movement. And he says things like this: environments are shaped into significance, and intelligence shifts from being the capacity to solve a problem to the capacity to enter into a shared world of significance. So rather than environment on one side and the human, here represented by the world intelligence, on the other, with this uncrossable rift between them, he's proposing that environments are shaped into significance by intelligence, and intelligence is also the capacity to enter into a conversation with these environments. Another quote by him: cognition consists in the enactment or bringing forth of a world by a viable history of structural coupling. This is where things get a bit technical. These are technicalities that are kind of halfway coming from philosophy and halfway into cognitive neuroscience. Varela himself was a neuroscientist, and he was studying vision, and I'll give some examples from his work, examples that also made him make such statements. So this is an example that he gives actually to explain this, to explain the ideas behind these quotes. He says, we always think of creatures that adapt to the environment as if the environment has always been there. And then you have biologists studying these adaptations, right? That's mostly the kind of conversation that we still have today, 30 years after Varela's book. But he says, well, imagine a bee and a flower. In this idea of structural coupling and of a very long time scales, it's not really believable that the flowers were just there, and then these creatures came and started to develop properties that made them attracted to flowers, and then in return they were bringing some advantages to the flowers, and then because of this payback, the creature that's now a bee developed. So the bee developed as a reaction to the flower as the environment. He says, actually, the bee and the flower most likely developed together. So over the course of evolution, in the beginning, the flower was not a flower of today had it not been for the bee, and the bee would have not been the bee of today had it not been for the flower. So they work together to become what they are now. And this is what Varela means by structural coupling. And of course, the book is about, is saying everything out there is structurally coupled. So we are structurally coupled with the environment. We are who we are because of the environment, but we've also changed the environment to be what the environment is today. So our human environment would not be what it is today had humans not been in there. Just the way this bee would not be the bee that it is today had it not been for that flower, and the other way around. And of course, the degree of complexity is absolutely humongous because we live in this environment or all together. But there is never this clean cut between who and what we are and the environment. We literally made the environment literally made us. And now I have a few more examples. These are all from papers that I'll be happy to share the source with anyone interested to go a bit deeper into this. When reading things and trying to understand again how does this how the gap, right? The gap between what is out there and what we are. I started to read about the Macy's papers. So these were kind of the conference proceedings from the 50s, from the first conferences in cybernetic. And it's very interesting how cybernetics started in the 50s, kind of at the intersection of biology and computational science. So that's what the current computer science was basically born out of. and programming and all of those notions. And they were really obsessed with a frog. So a paper had just come out back then from a team of biologists looking at the visual system of the frog. And they made the following statement. They said, the frog's retina is perfectly capable of perceiving large objects, but the brain is not interested in processing them. So for the frog's brain, these large objects just do not exist. They're not part of this animal's worldview. So what's happening again and again on the roads? Frogs are only interested in little things that fly that they can eat. They do not react to things like trucks. So if a frog is on the road and a truck is coming, even if it's quite slow, the frog will not move. Although the retina of the frog is seeing this thing, big, large moving body is just not part of the frog's worldview. So this is, again, hinting at another kind of gap that I'm sure we humans have as well. I'm sure there are many, many things out there that maybe our retina is perceiving, many, many things out there that maybe our retina is not, that could and probably do have massive consequences that are simply not part of our worldview. And this takes me to the example with the, I want to tell you about with the eye icon in the middle. So part of Varela's work on the vision system of humans was trying to understand how much when an image is formed in our consciousness, how is that image formed and what contributes to that? Since Varela, of course, there's been an incredible amount of work done in this direction, all confirming his findings. So Varela said, out of his very early measurements, he believes that only 20% of the visual information that is entering the brain through the optic nerve actually brings an apport to what the conscious image is. So 100% of the information is brought to the nerve, to the optic nerve, and 100% of that information enters the visual cortex, but only 20% is used. It means that 80% are influences that decide what we're supposed to see that are top down. So that's the name for other kind of things giving a say in what it is that we're seeing. I recently listened to a podcast with a top scientist that's doing exactly this kind of work that Varela did, and she stated with her voice slightly trembling that they believe it's 80% top down, if not more. Very, very likely it is more. But you could say with how much fear she said that, right? Because the implications that what's entering our retina is not really what we're seeing are quite difficult for us to stomach, right? Because we're so used to this paradigm that what we see is actually what is out there. And we're so stuck to touching this table and being like, but the table is here, right? So something that, again, I'm going to throw out there, maybe we'll come back to this later. This particular scientist, so not Varela, the contemporary scientist, is part of a school of thought that believe in what's called predictive coding. So they believe that the 80% that's top down is not like completely made up fairy tale information. It's actually a way for the brain to form the image faster. So the 80% is reusing information from the past, so that it doesn't, every time the information comes in, it doesn't put in the full effort to make the image. And I'll go into that also a little bit later. The third icon on the right a cup of hot liquid. There's amazing research out there, and like I love reading this stuff sometimes, that says that what you think about and the way you think about, so the way you perform certain mental operations change whether or not you're holding a cup of hot liquid or cold liquid. So just think about that for a second. And the more you read, of course, the plot kind of slowly starts to thicken in terms of what is our relationship to the outside world and what exactly do we call reality. I'm gonna make a quick. I wanna stop here quickly to see if there are any questions, because next I'm gonna jump into a bit of another angle to look of this. So this angle has been mostly math and Varela and cognitive neuroscience. And next I'm gonna have you look at the same things, but from a more philosophical, phenomenal angle. So are there any questions until here, or about the stuff that I went over so far?
My only question would be, is there a bibliography at the end, or the all these sources, because they're very interesting. So I definitely want everything. Yes,
absolutely. I will share a bibliography definitely by the end of the 4 days. I should have done a better job at going into the slides and also adding the source, so people watching later on YouTube can pause. But I will make the bibliography public and also make sure I'm linking to it when the YouTube videos get published.
Thanks.
Alex, you wrote a lot in the chat. Oh, Kim, do you want to, are any of these comments that you want to share? I'm struggling sometimes to skim through the chat fast enough.
I just like to be a little peanut gallery in the background. I wouldn't worry about it, Andrea. I'll just call out that the liquid study is a very interesting one, where we're so susceptible to manipulation by something as simple as holding a warm or cold cup of liquid, that it can actually change the perception of the person who gave it to us.
Yeah, and I think part of this discussion, and again, it's really just the tip of the iceberg, is to get everyone thinking about, like, quote unquote, how serious is this really, right? Because a lot of these things get dismissed as tricks, right? And I'll get to that as well. Like why, although the evidence that's coming out of the study is so compelling that we really live in the self-made illusion, why is it so easy to dismiss them as tricks and illusions? And that's kind of what we do many times. So here I'm missing a slide here. I apologize about that. So the slide that was supposed to come before this was the Necker cube, but I think all of you know what the Necker cube is. So it's this cube that is drawn like stick lines, and then you can focus on some of the sticks to kind of flip it. So sometimes it looks like it's seen from the bottom up, and sometimes it looks like it's seen from the top down. And that's also considered, like, classic illusion. Then you can take that to other things, like a corner of a room. If you stare, and I did that, it's hard, but you can do it, it's possible. If you stare at the corner of a room, so where three planes come together at 90 degrees, and you make sure you have no other thing in view, right? So you have no door, like picture frame or anything. So you kind of lose all kind of referentiality. If you stare at that long enough, it will flip on you. It will look like the corner is like coming inwards. This goes into the Gestalt theory of the 70s and the 80s that said that the eye is basically carving out shapes out of a mass of shadows and overlapping lights and shapes and information. And the light is the eye and the brain are basically seeing what they want to see, as in our human thinking is organized based on a few very clear things like categories. For example, we love categories. We love to put things into boxes. There's almost nothing on the street, in the room you're in the building that you're studying, that you are not able to put in a category. You're able to identify dogs as animals and tables as pieces of furniture. Basically, everything you see, you know what it is. And there are studies done where the moment something is so strange looking, you cannot put it into a human category, you would probably not see it. Your brain will just be like, and not compute it. It will literally not be there. And there have been
Andrea, so just quick, so is this similar to the concept that you don't see your nose? Is that your brain is literally saying, ignore this part of your reality, the nose on your face. Otherwise, if your brain comprehends it all day long, it would just interfere with everything you do. So is that kind of what you're saying, is that we're able to compartmentalize and the brain says that's unnecessary, so you don't see it?
It's similar. Yes, it's similar. Yes, it's part of the fact that the brain decides what to show us. The brain decides what's relevant to us. And the way human beings organize their life is through certain things like categories. There are a few other things that we can go over as well, but categories is one of them. So if something fits into a category, we're good. We know what it is. If it doesn't, it's probably not relevant for human life. So we're just going to ignore it. And I think what you're saying is that in some cases, the brain also ignores things for other purposes. And there's a range of purposes. I will give you another study that I read recently. It's the actual phenomenon or mechanism is called binocular. Shit, it has a great name, but I forgot a second word. Binocular something. Kim, you might know about this. I think I got to listen. I think this was an example in one of the podcasts that you sent me a link to a while back on aphantasia. But this is the experiment. So it was a research team, I think in Australia or New Zealand, and they did this. They got people in a lab, and they showed some of the people pictures of a house, like several pictures. So house. Okay, cool. So their brain was like, okay, we saw a bunch of houses. And then to the other people, they just saw heads, like faces. Okay, faces, cool. Then they put something on their eyes, kind of like, I think it was something like those glasses with lenses that you get at an eye doctor. Forgot name for that also. At an eye doctor, right? So and it basically it was showing people for a fraction of a second a house on one eye and a face on the other eye, but just very, very briefly. And the brain had to basically make the call. Do I tell this person, or do I give access to consciousness to a face or a house? And surprise, surprise, for the people that had been shown houses before entering that room with the glasses, the brain decided to show them houses. So when asked, after they took off the glasses, when asked, what did you see? Those people said houses. It wasn't like 100% of them, but it was like way more than statistically relevant. It was definitely against the odds. And the people who were shown, like, again, house on one eye, face on the other eye, but they were shown faces, asked, what did you see? They said they mostly said faces. So the brain made a call. The brain was like, okay, we just looked at faces for half an hour, so I guess we're interested in faces today. And the house must have been something weird, so let's just say face. And again, I'm gonna go now into starting to understand, okay, but is that the trick? Like, is that something that only happens when someone wants to trick us and is devising these things in the lab? Otherwise, we're safe. And of course, the answer that we're slowly going to work our way towards, but I'm sure it's not going to convince anyone, because this is like, huge body of work and references, is that no, it is not a trick, and yes, it is happening every day to us. So I wanna call on Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty is a French philosopher who wrote the amazingly influential, absolutely brilliant piece of work called The Phenomenology of Perception. I think is in 1954, I hope. And short description of phenomenology. Unfortunately, in these kind of discussions, we have to get into these big words that are kind of a mouthful. It's unfortunate, but I do also find it inevitable. And I think I'm still struggling myself in getting in conversations on these topics with how not to use them, or if I use them, how do I help people really understand what they mean? Because it's just not that easy, but then we really need them. Like the kind of vocabulary and the kind of concepts that we use on a daily basis and we all share, assuming like an average education, are just not enough. They're just falling short. So I've been in discussion where we did try to keep these fancy words out, and I feel we're not really getting anywhere. So I'm particularly interested in ways of bringing things like phenomenology, ontology into the discussion, and making sure people understand what they mean, and in a more long-term project of actually starting to come up with words and come up with methodology, because we are in territory that, again, is very far away from the kind of stuff we speak to each other every day, and we need new ways and new names for things. So phenomenology is the part of philosophy that is trying to describe human life from the perspective of the I. Like, what is the nature of the I that is perceiving? Phenomenology is, for some, it might sound like it's falling into the Descartes anxiety, which is assuming the world doesn't exist. It's a bigger conversation that I won't get into now in explaining why phenomenology is different than that, although it is saying we do not know what the world out there is about. All we can focus on is our own perceptions. It's a method of asking questions about the world, but going through the human perception and through the human understanding, and trying to find where the limitations in there, in what conditions can this perception tell us some kind of quote unquote truth, and how much can we trust that? So Merleau-Ponty is here on this slide now because he had a very beautiful way of answering the question, well, why are we being tricked all the time? Like, why don't we see the Necker cube flipping up and down? Why don't we see the corner of the ceiling popping in and out, like what you said you were able to do earlier? Why, if our perceptions are so unstable, if our brain can make random decisions all the time, why isn't that happening? Like, why are we confused? Why aren't we slowly going crazy? At least most of us. And he says, because the world is pregnant with meaning. That's the first metaphor that he uses. And I find that quite beautiful. So there is a shared world of categories and meaning, and all the objects that we surround ourselves with, whether they're man-made objects like keyboards and mice and books, or nature-made objects like trees and grass and flowers, all of those are so soaked into human meaning and human storytelling and human culture. There is nothing outside the window, man-made or nature-made, that I am not intimately familiar with what it is, that my parents did not thoroughly explain to me what it is and how it works when I was a baby, that I have not read books. Like we live in a world that's very comfortable, where these perceptions are fixed because it is the common beliefs and the categories existing in ourselves, in our brain, and in our society that's fixing them. Remember, I said when I stared at the corner of the ceiling and I got it to flip, and it looked like it's a volume coming at me. I mentioned the fact that I had to make sure that there is no picture frame or door frame in my field of view, because that reference would have brought meaning to what I was looking at, would have brought in the entire ecosystem of my brain, knowing that, okay, this is a house and a house has a door, and this is the right position for a door, which means this is a corner and this is the right way for me to show you the corner, and it would have fixed that. The other word that Merleau-Ponty uses in this context is thickness. So he says either that the world is pregnant with meaning or that the world has thickness. And that's what he means by thickness. It's very hard for us to cut through all this human meaning and look at an object afresh. It's actually almost impossible. There are strategies of doing that. There's mindfulness, Buddhism, psychedelics, all of that will help you look at a keyboard afresh, but let's just say they're not easily accessible, and they're not things embedded in a kind of methodology that would make those insights useful, at least not in my opinion, but maybe for people that are spiritual or religious, they, eventually they do become embedded into something that can influence their lives. So anyone has any thoughts or wants to jump in with any questions about this? Because something else is coming. So a third perspective is coming. Now, that was Merleau-Ponty.
I'd just like to throw in that in my experience, 40 years ago, all the graphics people that were building computer graphics from the ground up, all the ones that I knew, certainly in the Chicago area, did a lot of drugs, lots of hallucinogenics, all to sort of open their mind as to what the potential of computer graphics could be. And they built tools according to that perception of the world.
As I mentioned earlier, that most people in VR right now have had lucid dreaming. I don't think that's a coincidence. I know there was a lot of psychedelics being done at that time. I don't think any of this is a coincidence. And luckily, psychedelics, or at least the discussion around them, is slowly, very slowly starting to enter a more mainstream discussion. But yeah, I wish we were braver and making progress on these kind of things much faster, because we're still dealing with, as a VR developer, I feel like we're dealing with these very big questions, and we have to get at least the methodology out of it. And then we have things that are kind of hinting at things that could work, right? We have this different view of reality that's given by psychedelics. We have this amazing research coming out of cognitive neuroscience. We have first-person experiences that some of us had, like spontaneous out-of-body experiences or lucid dreaming. And it feels like they can kind of all get tied together. But the truth is that these different disciplines don't really talk to each other. And and the kind of assumptions that they make and the kind of discussions that they make do not really cross from one side into the other. All right, so now another perspective. As I said, this might be a little bit too much. I'm gonna throw the ball all over. And again, feel free to ask as many questions as possible, or like different perspective, or like disagree with anything that I say. Bang back here. Lakoff and Johnson. So Lakoff and Johnson published one of the most amazing books ever written about metaphors. And this is a book on linguistics. And what they mean by metaphors are things like looking up to signify positive feelings, or saying the candidates are at war with each other, or things like break a leg to mean good luck, although the connection between that and the actual action is unclear. Or I'm going to tear apart your ideas. So they started their work by looking at how language that belongs to the physical movement of bodies in space comes and takes over language that is used for abstract thinking. And this was the start of a most exciting area in linguistics and in research. And the more they dug into it, and many other labs across the US and Europe have started to have teams working on this. The more they looked at it, the more they found that the way we seem to structure a lot of our thoughts, and thoughts about things that are not physical objects in reality, like politics, democracy, being a candidate for something, wishes, desires, competition, right? So all of those things belong to special categories, right? They do not belong to the way we categorize physical objects in the world. We, as humans, we also have these other kind of categories where we put in abstract things. They found by analyzing language that we seem to manipulate these abstract concepts and understand them and formulate them and put them together and communicate them again, to change them again, using what they call metaphors from physical movement. And they came up with this statement, which when I read, it completely blew me away. They said, metaphors are neural phenomena. They recruit sensory motor interfaces for use in abstract thought. And I was like, wow. The implications of this, I just could think forever about them. And for me, at least, I don't know about you, but for me, it just gave me such a fresh understanding of, well, anything. I used to, like, I meditate, and I still do, I guess, exercises that are meant to help me understand what is the nature and structure of my thoughts. I don't know if any of you meditate or do those kind of exercises or have an interest in that. But if you do, you're familiar with the fact that we do not know where our thoughts come from. It is impossible to say, oh, that came from there and there and there. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. Like, most of the time, something will just like come up in your consciousness, and you do not know where it came from. So the relationship between the workings of the brain and what we call consciousness, so what we're aware of, is completely mysterious, to the point where actually it slowly turned me into one of those people who does not believe we have free will, who believes it's really the brain that just kind of springs this thought into our mind. But of course, there is some degree in which we feel agency in manipulating these thoughts. But again, whenever you are able to trace them, you can't trace them for too long. Usually you trace them through language. Usually the kind of thoughts that you're able to verbalize or become aware of are thoughts that have words in most people. There's some people who have thoughts that have images. And there's some very interesting studies on those in just trying to understand what thoughts are. So we don't have good definitions of that. We don't know how we manipulate thoughts. We don't know if it's the brain or quote unquote us. And by us, I mean the conscious mind that we have access to. And this proposition that whatever manipulation of conscious thoughts we might have, or even unconscious, actually comes from our experience moving in the world, has been amazing. And I will go into showing research that shows how areas in the hippocampus that is manipulating abstract concepts are in some cases the same areas where motor actions take place. So areas in the brain that are responsible for motor actions are the areas in the brain that are responsible in some cases for abstract thought. Here, very recently, Mind in Motion is a book by Barbara Tversky that came out, I believe 2 years ago, that is everything we've been talking about and more. And she's proposing what she calls the 9 laws of cognition. And I'm going to go through this quickly, and then we'll, over the next 2-3 days, we'll start to tease things out of this particular number 6 and start to connect them with VR examples, right? So the reason why I'm throwing so many things at the wall right now is because I'm interested to see where we'll stick. Well, I know that some will stick because I've already made those connections, but I'm interested also in having a conversation to see maybe you guys see things sticking that I did not. So to see what sticks when we later bring on concrete examples from things we observe in virtual reality. So these are her 9 laws of cognition. There are no benefits without costs. Briefly, what does she mean by this? She means whenever someone is extremely focused, whenever someone is multitasking, there are benefits to that, but there are also cognitive costs. So whenever you think you can do something faster, there's probably a downside to that in terms of cognitive processing levels and speeds. And there are many studies on this kind of stuff that show that the average person has a very predictable and somewhat limited cognitive ability in terms of how many concepts they can manipulate at the same time in the mind. Action mauls perception. This is what we were talking about before, Lakoff and Johnson. So action mauls perception, which again is mind-blowing. So the way we move in the world and the way we pick things up and the way we run and we jump in the environment changes the way we perceive things. And she has dedicated her entire career. She's towards the end of her career now. She's an emeritus professor. She has decades in the lab with amazing examples backing up each of these things, and it's just mind-blowing. Number 3 is feeling comes first before recognition. So lots of interesting work being done right now in understanding what emotion is, right? Because again, traditionally and in the culture we still live on in everyday life, we tend to separate emotion from rational thought. And it's becoming more and more clear that that's another relic from our friend Descartes, and that feelings and emotions also carry us, they they're also traces of processing. They're also bringing us information that we should do better at reading and understanding what emotions are trying to tell us, rather than discard them and try to replace them by quote unquote rational thoughts. 4, the mind can override perception. This is the example that I gave you with the 2 groups of people. One shown houses, one shows faces, and then the mind chose which one to show consciousness. 5, cognition mirrors perception. So again, we touched on this. The way we perceive things is structurally the same to how we think of things, because in many cases that's actually happen in the same parts of the brain. 6, spatial thinking is the foundation of abstract thought. So this is what my entire work in virtual reality is about. I'm hoping the 4 days will converge on number 6, because 6 is monumental. Spatial thinking is the foundation of abstract thought. And if you are a little bit familiar with the kind of talks and things I usually give, I'm very clear with statements such as, I really believe we can design virtual reality applications and environments that can help us not just think faster or understand something faster or more thoroughly, but that can help us think differently. And this entire body of research and observations are actually geared at making this point at the end of the 4 days. Number 7, the mind fails in misinformation. We know this. Number 8, when thought overflows the mind puts it in the world. So she's describing all human activity as thought that enters the world, where that is through projects you develop with your team, things you paint, things you do. So basically everything your hands decide to, like, take this pencil and from here it puts it there. It has some reason for doing that. But she describes all of these as things that leave the mind. So they overflow the mind. They're born as thoughts. They overflow the mind and they go out there into the world. And then something in the world happens. And not only something happens, most of the time, the other human beings relate to that. So your thoughts are, unless you're, I don't know, just lying in bed or completely like chilling, your thoughts are constantly overflowing, exiting your mind and doing things into the world. And number 9, we organize stuff in the world the way we organize stuff in the mind. This was also a mind-blowing one for me. Oh my God, how many things could we talk about when it comes to this in the context of VR? But before we get to VR and what VR can do with this kind of proposition, right? I feel like we need to sit down with it and let it sink deeper. We organize stuff in the world the way we organize stuff in the mind. Like, holy shit. But yeah, we'll go back to this one again later. I want to do another quick break here and see if there are any questions coming up. Alex says, loving everything in the chat. All right, guys, I need some help with the chat because it's a lot for me to read. So I really encourage some of you to maybe just open your mic and read it out loud if you wrote something interesting in the chat, because I know maybe some other people also have a hard time listening and reading, so they might be missing these observations.
I think what Alex was saying is hopefully there's a setting, and it's a setting somewhere in Zoom for the chat to be saved and possibly shared. Because sometimes I think we've taken up Alex's model of sharing stuff that is relevant whenever to whatever you're saying at any point. Because we don't want to interrupt.
All right. Then I'm gonna look into that. So before I close the session, I'm gonna make sure that I know how to save the chat. But I would love for people to kind of jump in and share some of these things.
I had something to say, but I don't want to derail your talk too much. This actually is my area of expertise in my research, is this connection between sort of situated, what I call situated mediated action, or how we interact with reality. And I work a lot with conceptual structure, all within the framework of virtual reality and physical computing and interacting with computation this way. And so it's really exciting to hear these perspectives of yours. And in hearing all these things, I know there's a bunch of complementary theories that might be that might be of interest to you and everyone else. And just to briefly evoke some of these, there's cultural historical activity theory, which is quite interesting in terms of looking into, as a complement to Lakoff and Johnson, there's this another idea called conceptual blending, which kind of expands upon this in different ways. I find affordance theory complementary to this, as well as ideas around situated cognition. There's an amazing paper by Michael Kimmel that talks about how embodiment and concepts and culture all tie together, which has all these implications for how we design our environments and how our environments shape us. Yeah, and one thing I'll also say, Tversky was talking about how spatial thinking is the foundation of abstract thought, which you do see a lot in Lakoff and Johnson, as well as in conceptual blending. But it also, with Kimmel, you see there is this, there are certain building blocks that are culturally specific. And I think there's some others that are more kind of relatively somatic and also might be more temporal depending on the culture. But they can all kind of work in concert with space. Anyways, I have more to say, but I think just wanted to kind of pop in and add those things to the mix of ideas.
Oh, thank you so much for this. I think this is perfect. What was the name of the paper or the author that you referred to last? Like Michael, but I missed the name.
Michael Kimmel. I can try to find it and put it in the chat. It's like the arc of the body to culture, concept and culture. Yeah, and I have actually I just finished my dissertation on this, kind of weaving a lot of these thoughts together. And unfortunately, it's a very long form factor. And I haven't packaged it into smaller articles yet. But if anyone would be interested in reading it, I'd be very happy to send along if it would be of use, because it does weave these ideas together in a strong way, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely be interested in reading that. And if you can share, if you can email me a little bibliography with some of these things, I'll be happy to send it to everyone, to all the participants. Maybe one or two of these things might actually spark the interest. And yeah, thank you so much for coming here. And I'm so curious to see when we get to the more VR examples, how from the perspective of all these things that I'm not that familiar with, how you will start to interpret the VR stuff, right? Because the point of the workshop is for us to have some kind of conceptual basis. So I'm kind of throwing a few perspectives out there for a conceptual basis, and then the fun will begin tomorrow and the days after, where we actually look at some VR phenomena and try to understand them and try to see what do they mean and how we take them further from this perspective. So it would be wonderful to have you be part of that conversation then, because I think this is where I mean, not everyone agrees with me, but I think this is where the VR developers are a little bit stuck. Like, I don't know how familiar you are with what's happening in VR, and there are a few nice games and stuff, but overall, we keep doing things that are not as exciting as they should be, and we keep failing to have the right kind of conversations. So that's kind of what gave me the boldness of be like, okay, why don't we start from the beginning, and why don't we like widen the circle to start to get to some stuff. So yeah, thank you, and really looking forward to having you here in the next 3 days.
Likewise, and I'll send those things along. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so this is something that we're gonna get more into this, but again, now we're into like throwing things at the wall phase. So the most exciting stuff that came out of VR research lately, and it was 2016. I'm sure you are familiar with this, but and tomorrow we will look at specific parts of this paper. Now I just put up the abstract, and I just want to introduce the concept. Initially, I wanted to this part of the presentation to stick to theories, concepts, philosophy, like not go so much so fast into VR. But I feel like this gives you a taste of what's coming and of potential connections between what we've been talking so far and what's going on in VR. That's good to just have a glimpse now. So in 2016, this paper came out with a very, very funky name called homuncular flexibility. And people are like, what? So homuncular flexibility, the human ability to inhabit non-human avatars. Man, I really had to read this a few times when it came out. Although the more I thought about it, the more connections started to pop up in my head. See what I said earlier, I can't really trace my thoughts most of the time. The right thing just pops up in my head. So on the left is the rubber hand illusion. Again, I'm sure everyone is familiar with this, but it's worth repeating because it's like the most amazing thing ever. I don't know exactly when the first time, who did this for the first time or where. There have been many reenactments of it, but basically this is the main idea. Your real hand is behind a partition. You cannot see your real hand, but on the right, on the visible side of the partition, the side that you can see, they put a rubber hand, that like a human looking rubber hand. And a lab assistant is striking rhythmically both your real hand and your rubber hand so that you feel the strokes on your real hand, and your eyes are seeing the strokes on the rubber hand. And very, very quickly, you will start to identify as the locus of the striking sensation inside the rubber hand. It is most unusual. It happens for most people, and it happens like eerily fast. So what's happening is basically, not always, but in many situations, the visual cortex is the boss. So there is feedback going into other parts of the brain saying, hey, the touch is happening on that side, somewhere else on that side of the partition. But the visual cortex is the boss, and the visual cortex is integrating. The visual cortex has to integrate sensorial information. And sensorial information that comes in is a mess, right? But the brain's job is to make reality manageable, digestible, right? And to make it fit the human categories and to make fit the story. So the human story of what reality and life and we are has to, so it's taking this messiness of information from the senses and fits the human story. And lots of compromises are being made. We talked about many examples. In this case, the visual cortex has the upper hand. Its job is to integrate conflicting information, which is it's seeing the stroke in a different place from where it is feeling the stroke. Okay, that's a problem. What do? Well, we solve the problem. and it's giving primacy to the visual information. It does that most of the time, although the exceptions are interesting. So it's moving, it's literally moving the location that you think the stroke is coming from, like half a foot to the side. And it's the most believable thing, to the point where sometimes the lab assistants are picking up like a hammer or something and really like smashing the rubber hand, and people are completely terrified and jump off their seat because they really believe that their real hand is going to get smashed and hammered down. So what's the story here, and how does that connect with homuncular flexibility? Well, I have not told you what the homuncular flexibility paper says. It basically says that there is the extent to which our brains have this property called neuroplasticity, the ability to reorganize input and output and shift things around, is so large that you can go in virtual reality and you can get trained to inhabit non-humanoid bodies. So you can get trained so that your brain thinks like you can move octopuses with multiple tentacles around in a way that you actually identify with. So there, a similar mechanism is at play. Your visual cortex is seeing certain things, it is getting certain kind of inputs, and it's just connecting the things together, and it's pushing a certain kind of logic that feels like it makes sense to you. And in creating that logic that makes sense to you, the conscious person in the brain is cutting a lot of corners, is making up a lot of fantasies. But I think what people are, again, not so much aware of, and continue to put things like this into the trick category, is that, well, it doesn't really happen with me walking on the street. So it's really not that big of a deal. And in a sense, I would have agreed to that. But now we have this technology that puts VR headsets in the hands of millions of people, or tens of millions and millions of teenagers. So all of a sudden, no group of scientists has to play tricks on you for you to experience this kind of things. It's enough to put a headset on and go into like VR chat and play around with body tracking and do some funky stuff, go into some non-humanoid things, and walkiness has arrived in your life. So I and please feel free to disagree with me. There are many perspectives to look at this, but for me, this technology is very, very quickly opening up the gates to something that is an innate ability of our brains, but that before was kind of fenced in. It was we were really being so strict about all these norms and the way you live life and the kind of things you do, that it would just so rare that you would run upon some wacko thing or some sensation, and then it was dismissed as a trick. Whereas now this technology is placing us in a situation where we might not be, it might just kind of, the floods might come, and so many people, especially young people, might all of a sudden experience things that will feel in the same time very unfamiliar and very unfamiliar and eerie, but also, I don't want to say the word normal. I think I'm missing the word. I don't know what the word is, but as someone that has had out-of-body experiences induced through meditation, I can tell you that these tricks that you feel between your consciousness and an altered state of your physical body also feel normal. They are not an anomaly in your brain. There's nothing that's happening that shouldn't be happening. they are a reflection of exactly how your brain works and should be working and is been working all along. It's just opening the gates for, it's just gonna make it harder for us to fence that in. And it's asking many, many questions, in my opinion, about to what extent are we gonna have to rethink and redefine the way we live life and the norms that we live by when this is gonna become a normal occurrence. So this is from the abstract. Homuncular flexibility posits that the homunculus is capable of adapting to novel bodies, in particular bodies that have extra appendages. In the recent advent of virtual reality technology, which can track physical human motions and display them on avatars, allows for the wholly new human experience of inhabiting distinctly non-human bodies. So nowhere do they say that this is just for some special people. Nowhere. This is not just for the lucky ones with special brains. This is everyone's brain, fortunately or unfortunately. Yes.
If I may, I just wanted to add like to the discussion, because I'm doing a lot of work right now for a research paper on like virtual reality's ability to have us inhabit non-human bodies, and a lot of the research in that field seems to suggest that, maybe older research, that it needed to be pretty anthropomorphic bodies, but I think more recent research, specifically focusing with agency and active embodiment, I think points to more non-human bodies as a possibility. So if anyone has interesting resources on that, please send them to me, but also I can share a lot of the researches I've been doing on that topic. But I wanted to just give a really commonplace example from Merleau-Ponty about how we come to like inhabit these bodies that are more than human. Like Merleau-Ponty talks about when you wear a tall hat and you know to dip when you go through a door to not hit this hat, which has become an extension of your body, or the car, you come to know that this car is an extension of your body. You know how wide it is, you know whether you can park in some place or not. And you know, there's huge amounts of research in post-phenomenology done as to, you know, using a probe or using tools to extend our field of perception. So like, again, there's like a ton of research in that field, not to contradict whatever you're seeing, but just to point to the fact that, you know, it's not considered an illusion that I know how wide my car is and whether I can pass through a certain entryway or not. So a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So Don Ide also mentions a lot the other common Ponty example, which is the man with a cane, where if you talk to a blind person that routinely uses a cane, they will describe to you how they feel the tip of the cane touching the pavement, as if it was part of their own body, as if it was like their finger touching that. So they feel every little bump and change in a very visceral way. They feel like they have nerve endings, basically, at the tip of the cane. So yes, this is, and it's the same with driving a car and all of that. The part, however, that is quite different is this. I don't think we understand that well what this means when these changes happen to the body and not to the equation U plus car. Because whatever that coupling U and car must have done to your perception and sense of body in space, the moment you get out of it and leave it in the garage, you're good. At least I haven't heard anyone report any kind of issues with that. But in the case of the man with the cane, this connection is much more important and much more visceral. I have another similar example that I think will connect to the discussions we'll keep going into with VR and avatars. There is an exercise there's an exercise, I think it's in the Buddhist tradition, I might be wrong, but I believe it's in the Buddhist tradition, with novice monks are given a bunch of exercises to kind of help them go deeper and deeper into states of meditation. And one of them is the following assignment. They are told to go for a few days, I think it's 3 or 4 days, and live on their own, either in an isolated part of a village or in the forest, and imagine every single second that they have horns, like big horns growing out of their heads, like a not reindeer, there's like another animal, like a moose kind of horns, big horns, and they're supposed to just really live life and eat and sleep and walk about, enforcing very vividly this feeling. And they're told to imagine how heavy it will be and how their head would feel if these big pieces of wood actually, right, like would grow on their heads. And then when they end the period ends and they come back to the monastery, what the other people are reporting is that these people, when they walk through a door, with a head like this. Because they've internalized the presence of these horns to such an extent that they quote unquote know that their horns would not fit through the door. So they have to like go sideways and then like pass through the door like that. And of course that fades, but this takes me into something that's a very big deal to me, which is phenomena that are going to start to cross dimensions. So is you identifying with something that is added to your body schema, and I have not explained what a body schema is, but I think I will tomorrow. Is you spending hours in VR that is adding something that becomes part of your body schema? Is that thing going to disappear immediately when you take the headset off, just the way you get out of the car and the equation, the entity car and you is like over until next time you get in? And there are things that indicate that it is not. There are things that indicate that once that coupling has happened, it might take some time to fade. So we might be very literally dealing with situations where, you know, you do go through the door with your head sideways because you don't want your horns to bump into the frame of the door. And one last comment. I am aware of some of the research that Thomas Metzinger did at ETH. I think it's all the research as well. You might be familiar with it. It's not non-humanoid avatars, but it is using VR to very quickly generate out-of-body experiences. So to create like the typical experience that your body is actually 1 or 2 meters in front or ahead of you. And I think it's slightly different than the non-human bodies, and it's slightly different than the conversation with body schemas, but I do think there's some overlap in the mechanism that is triggering that. And now, so the point, there's one point I want to make on this slide, and it's the line that is, that's the words that are underlined there. We've all heard so much about the so-called disenchantment of nature, right? Like the Enlightenment took over and we started science, and the scientific method now is showing us the way. And in that process, nature became disenchanted. Like we know everything there is to know. We can make measuring devices that give us some access into reality with capital R, and we know these are true because we go ahead and make engines and produce medication and do all of these things in the world of engineering that actually works, right? That's the story. Now, there is a second kind of thing that I propose is starting to happening, which is what all of this is about, as far as I'm concerned, is what I call the disenchantment of the mind. Just the way we're done with nature, or almost done, like no one is considering that, there are huge aspects of nature that still have to be understood. By the way, with the spatial dimension of nature, geography being the first thing to fall. We are right now rapidly entering an era of this disenchantment of the mind, where, of course, we're still dealing with things like the multi-billion euro failed brain project that the EU funded a few years ago about neural correlates. So that was a project based on the idea that you could find correlation between neural activity and the subjective experience of a subject, right? So you would, if they only threw enough billions at this project, we would get to the point where someone will feel something or tell you something, and they'll immediately see a pattern corresponding to that in the brain, which means, of course, that you get to the point where you just observe the pattern on the brain, and then you know what that person is thinking or feeling. That completely failed. So there are many dead ends. But despite that, we have still entered very recently an era of just rapid research that's giving us so much insight into, well, first cognition, backed by neuroscientific research, and we've been seeing. So just the way the main wave of science and scientific methods has started to show practical applications. Unfortunately, we see some practical applications of this in social media platforms, designing things that are more and more like dumber and dumber, but more and more addictive, and things like that. In this context, having virtual reality basically have access to your motor cortex and your visual cortex is something both mind-blowing to me and terrifying. So I'm not even going to get into this talk into the whole biometric data and collection and privacy. That's a big topic on its own that many people are very focused on. So if anyone is interested in that, I can point you to those people. I won't get into it. I just want to address it from the point of like the cognitive perspective. As a developer before, we used to develop things for mobile devices, for the screen where you click around with the mouse. And so that gave us a possibility to put visual information into the minds of players or users. And that was extremely powerful, and it changed quite a lot, if not everything. Now we're entering a moment with virtual reality where developers have ways to either control or attempt to control both information and reactions targeted at the visual cortex and the motor cortex and a few other things. But just like we have seen in some of the examples we look at, crazy, interesting, unexpected things can be triggered in a person's mind, specifically when the information from the motor cortex is not aligned with that from the visual cortex. Like you're putting the brain in a situation to make decisions that can be unpredictable. So this is, and then we have this research that's starting to come out that is helping us attempt theories and methodologies. Of course, we're going to be wrong about most of them, but there's some that we're starting not to necessarily to be right about, but to, let's say that they're starting to work. And I'll show some of that when we get to looking at the projects we've been doing at Numena. So it's really a phase where software developers like ourselves are taking this research, trying to understand these mechanisms. And again, we don't care about right and wrong, that's the scientists, but we're starting to understand, like us as developers, we're starting to understand enough. And on the scientist part, they're starting to be right enough so that we can make things work in the applications. So that's what I mean by the era of the disenchantment of the mind, and specifically how that is impacting the work software developers are starting to do, and the kind of applications you can start to produce. Okay, how is everyone doing? I have one more thing. Should we leave this for next time? Is it we are almost 2 hours into it. Any last thoughts? So the last perspective that I have is, of course, Foucault with a little bit of Rousseau.
Yeah, my brain has already exploded. You may as well just finish it off.
All right, let's do it. And I want to remind you one of the slides that I first started with, in which I proposed this way of having us sleep over all this overnight, and then starting tomorrow with a reframing of everything we talked about today. So if this feels too much, it is because it is for everyone, but I don't want anyone to try to get it or understand it or make sense of it too fast. I think that's a danger. So let it percolate in your head, and let's talk about what we just talked about again tomorrow. Okay, so technologies of the self. I love this phrase so much. I wish I had come up with it, but of course I did not. It was Foucault. Foucault is like, oh man, how do you describe Foucault? I think you should look it up. He's like, he's too monumental for me to introduce. He's one of the big guys in French philosophy. He's a structuralist, monumentally important. He did work at the intersection of philosophy and social science. Sharp as a blade, like one of the sharpest, clearest thinkers in European philosophy. And there is a book that's the last book that was published of his. It's a collection of lectures he gave. I can't remember now at which university. He never finished the lectures. The lectures were supposed to be the basis for his latest book. He never finished the lectures. He never wrote the book because he died. But the transcripts of whatever lectures he did give appeared in this book called Technologies of the Self. And this is what he's talking about in them. So I'm actually, I'm not gonna grab onto any of the main Foucault ideas. I'm just gonna go all the way at the last unfinished thing that he did. What does he mean by technologies of the self? He became very interested in how it feels to be a subject, how it feels to be you is created, is put into your head or develops into your head, or however you want to put it, and in some cases changes. To put it simply, how it feels to be us, people living in 2022, coming from a certain socioeconomic background, being interested in this topic, is wildly different than how it felt to be a musician in the 17th century. Just wildly different in many, many different ways. And of course, how it feels to me, Andrea, is definitely wildly different than how it feels to be each of you, but we're just not very good at communicating those differences. Because again, there's some vocabulary and some science going on in trying to understand those things, but it has not really broken into popular conversation and popular culture. But as someone in my late 30s, I'm still discovering every day that the way I assume everyone's mind works is very much not so. So I'm fascinated by this topic also at a personal level, because I'm in many ways I grew up assuming things about how people think based on how I think, that ended up being so wildly wrong. I could have never thought that in a million years. So but I'm not talking about how we think differently. I'm not talking about maybe one of us being dyslexic, one of us having ADD and things like that. No, I'm talking about in a deeper sense, how it feels to be that human being. So Foucault called this technologies of the self, and he started to look at different time periods and different writers who wrote about that. He looked at ancient Greece. He looked at Roman emperors and read that wrote diaries and read how these people were describing how it felt to be eating breakfast in the morning on a particular estate. And he started to kind of track how that differs for people in different timelines, and what might generate that feeling of what it is to be a human being living there at that point. And inevitably that took him to Rousseau. Again, Rousseau is also so monumental, I can barely introduce him, but he's another French philosopher, much earlier than Foucault. I think he's 18th century, and very influential, even fighting for human rights, the ideas of the French Revolution and so on. And in this context, Foucault was interested in him because Rousseau was one of the first ones that not only started to write about, but to even introduce techniques that create the modern subject. So this is the time period in human history in the West where the modern state was created. And as a political and social project, the modern state could not exist without modern subjects. And whatever it felt to be human and to live and to think, whatever it is that people were thinking back then, was not possible, was not the right kind of thing for the modern state. And people like Rousseau knew that, so they started almost like a campaign to turn those people that were there into modern subjects that think the way the modern state needs them to think. So that's a lot of Rousseau's work, but not from the perspective of being critical about it. A lot of it is actually from the perspective of an insider into it. So in this context, both Foucault and Rousseau are talking about the emergence of a subject. So when the modern state was created in the Western world, a program was put forward to create the modern subject. And then we did see over about a century the emergence of a subject. So people who think of themselves, firstly, as individuals in a state. That was not the case before. And who start to fall in line and have very deep visceral relationships to that state and to the rules of that state. This is a quote from Foucault. For a long time, ordinary individuality, the everyday individuality of everybody, remained below the threshold of description. What does this mean? This is also goes back to Rousseau. It means before this modern world, there are very rare descriptions of how it felt to be an individual. That's why Foucault was really chasing them, right, in Roman emperors and Greek philosophers, because most people could not really verbalize even this concept of individuality. It just didn't really exist. You just didn't think in those terms. You were, it's, I mean, even I'm struggling to verbalize this, but I love his phrasing, right? Bring the brilliant person he was, below the threshold of description. So there were things people felt, and it felt in a certain way to be who they were, but for a long time that was below the threshold of description. And one of the things Rousseau and a bunch of others did is introduce texts and things in school and conversations that helped verbalize this. And why? Well, because when you can put your finger on it and it's out in the open and you can verbalize it and people understand it, then you can start to shape it. Why am I bringing this up? Because I believe, and I'm going to bring in another big word right now. I believe what this is about is the chance that technology like virtual reality is going to start to change how it feels to be human. And I'm not saying this lightly. I actually think if I could emphasize it even more, I would. If how it feels to be human, again, as we said, changes over long periods of time, I believe technology like VR can alter that rhythm so that this change happens in a way that's much more accelerated. The philosophical term for this is subjectivity. So how it feels to be you, this technology, well, technology of self actually means the mechanism that changes that, but how it feels to be you is called subjectivity, not to be confused with things that are subjective. So that's the technical term. We're going to refer to that a bit later too. And is this a big deal? Yes. Out of all the things we talked about, including embodying the octopus, I would say this is the harder to wrap your head around, but it's also the one that could potentially have monumental impact and reach, both positive and negative. All right, we got to the end. So quick summary. What have I tried to do today? I have tried to raise some doubt. I've tried to create a gap in your mind between objective reality, reality with capital R, and the human world. And by the human world, I mean everything, like your perception, your consciousness, your brain, categories, language, culture, everything. Because as we said, everything, including the tree outside and the blade of grass, everything is within the story, like within our human story. There's nothing outside it. There's nothing that we can see objectively outside the scientific method, although I have lots to say about that too, but that's a talk for another day. And I have also tried to hint at the fact that the mechanism that generates this human world is malleable. We have not yet, but we will, gone into what exactly are these mechanisms. I mean, we've hinted at a bunch of them, and we can maybe start tomorrow by summarizing that. So we've hinted at mechanisms like trying to verbalize things, trying to have books, literature, education, which is what Rousseau did, and part of the creation of the modern state that changes your views about the world and how it feels to be you at a very deep level. So that's one mechanism. And then there are technological mechanisms. So VR will fall under a technological mechanism that kind of that goes into this gap and starts to push the story that we tell about who we are and what we do in certain directions. Yeah, so where are the strings? Can tech pull the strings? Is tech pulling them? Should tech pull them? Who controls the tech? Who, again, this last question goes into the direction we will not cover in the seminar, but I think it's worth bringing up.